I'm Marianne Williamson, and thank you so much for being with me. One of the most exciting things about doing a podcast is that you get to have conversations with people that excite you, interest you, fascinate you. And it's an honor to be able to have deeper conversations with some of the people whose works have meant so much to me personally. This is definitely true about my guest today, author Sue Monk Kidd, who is, in my mind, one of our very, very finest contemporary American authors. You know, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Russian writer who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, said that a writer is a government in exile. Sue Monk Kidd takes topics of historical importance and she turns them into stories, often about characters who actually lived, historical figures who were not just cardboard characters. They were real, living, breathing people, flesh and blood. And nowhere is that truer than in her book, The Invention of Wings. Also, another book I talked to her about in this podcast is a book called The Book of Longings. How lucky I am to have been able to talk to Sue Monk Kidd about those two books and her journey as an artist. And be sure to stick around after the interview when I answer a couple of questions. You know, if you want me to answer a question, you can write to me at marianne@castmedia.com, and I'll try to take yours. And now, enjoy the conversation. Sue, thank you so much for doing the interview with me. It means a lot to me. It's a real honor to be able to talk to you.
Well, it's an honor to be able to talk to you as well.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, when you wrote The Invention of Wings, obviously these are historical characters. It's a nonfiction story, but it's basically a fictional dramatization. But the Grimke sisters lived. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were actual people, right?
They were, and I wish I had known about them earlier than I did.
What do you think that you could have brought to the story if you had known about them earlier that you didn't bring to the story now?
Probably not anything different to the story, but I just felt like I had missed something by not knowing of these two incredible women. And they seem to be not well known or were not well known in anything but maybe ivory towers of academia or something. But they fell through a little crack in history.
Well, the fact that they were unknown seems to me to be part of a larger factor of invisibility. You know, when I started reading more deeply into American history in order to write a book called The Healing the Soul of America at the end of the 90s, I realized that so much of the racial history of the United States had been erased, had become a cardboard stereotype, a story that we told ourselves, a narrative that was so shallow and so one-dimensional as compared to the many, many layers of trauma, the many, many layers of human dynamics. And so, of course, it makes sense that the people who played huge parts in the story, and I think that the Grimke sisters, from reading your book, it's very clear that people like the Grimke sisters were very much a part of the story and a part of the story that we need to understand. You know, when I was giving lectures and was talking about your book to audiences, I talked about the fact that the biggest issue for me was that I had come to appreciate the difference between being anti-slavery and being an abolitionist. What that bridge was that people had to cross within themselves from the point where they didn't agree with something, they might not live in a slave state, they might not think that they would ever own slaves, but that of itself would not have moved the needle for even one enslaved person. Whereas the abolitionist was someone who had crossed that bridge. And many of them were people, like in the song Amazing Grace, who had been blind and then saw. You know, when I drive through the American South, and I have quite a bit, to see the beauty of the land and to appreciate what had been some aspects of the beauty of the Confederate lifestyle, that such evil existed in the background, that such evil fueled it. And of course, the Grimke sisters, what the book talked about, what I'd love to hear from you now, I assume they were part of a rather large strata of people who were raised in slave-owning states, who were raised in slave-owning families, and yet their eyes were opened. They came to see what was true.
You know, I actually think discovered in my research that the Grimke sisters were rather rare, unfortunately. I think, and that may be because their other stories haven't been told yet. Certainly, there were people like the Grimke sisters who were raised in slave-owning families who saw the light. Whether they, I don't think they quite reached the pinnacles of working toward and voicing all of this that the Grimke sisters did. But what struck me most about Angelina Grimke and Sarah Grimke, one of the many things really, was that it was so unusual and unexpected. And I mean, they were audacious in what they did. And when you think about what they had to overcome to become the first female abolition agents in America, it really is extraordinary. I mean, here are two women who lived in a elite level of society in a slave-owning family whose father was the Supreme Court judge in South Carolina, state judge, and who were both wealthy, religious, and yet they were different. They just were different. And I don't know whether it was the fact that they had a very acute moral conscience, but what they had to do that was so hard was to find their voice in the midst of this culture. And they gave up everything. I mean, in order to voice their truth about the justice and anti-slavery ideas, they really had to leave their homeland, their religion, their culture. They became pariahs in Charleston, and they became exiles in the North. So they lost a lot, but they gained a lot.
Yeah, and so did America. So a theme, obviously, that runs throughout your book, certainly these two, Invention of Wings and the Book of Longings, is women who lived the largeness of themselves. And they certainly lived the largeness of themselves. Now, in the book, their conversion came about because of the Quakers. Was that true historically?
Yes, it was. Well, their conversion to the abolition cause did come through the Quakers in some sense, but they were already anti-slave oriented long before they read the Quaker literature. I think what the Quakers did for them was to give them an exit strategy. It allowed them to see a way to leave their culture and their homeland and go north. So they were fighting already in many, many ways, but not able to really make a dent too much, while
as long as they were in the South. Right.
As long as they were in the South.
The character of Handful, which is in the book, according to the research and your interviews that I have read, Handful did exist, but she was someone who died at a much younger age than she dies in the book. One of the most searing scenes in the book is when these two little girls had grown up as best friends, the little black girl and the little white girl. And then at a certain point, when they're around 5, the little black girl has to sleep on the floor. The little white girl sleeps in the bed, and both children are like asking, why? Why do you get to sleep up there and I have to sleep down here? And then, of course, when Handful is given to the little white girl as a Christmas gift, this is the moment when the minds of both of them exploded as they came to understand what was happening here. Several years ago, actually not a couple of years ago, I was driving in Mississippi. I suppose it's Gulfport, and I wanted to go to the museum, which was Jefferson. What was his name? The president of the
Jefferson Davis.
Jefferson Davis, right? The president of the Confederacy, his home. And there just happened to be a Civil War reenactment going on that day. So I got out of the car. I wanted to watch it, and I saw that there were bumper stickers there in the parking lot, and I saw a lot of them that said "Pride, not prejudice." And I thought it was so interesting. How can people have the pride and not recognize the evil that is going on in the background? I ask you not only because I'm interested in the Grimke sisters, but because I don't think it's that different today. There is
Well,
some psychological dissociation from concern for the well-being of other human beings that is at the heart and the core of racist systems. Would you agree with that?
absolutely. That was one of the large questions that I tried to confront when I was writing The Invention of Wings, and really even before that with The Secret Life of Bees, but very particularly with this book. And what was astonishing was that evil seems to happen when no one's watching. And it happens slowly, and it gathers. And we become sort of familiar with it, and we become more adaptable to it, and we normalize it. That was what seemed to be happening with the slavery, because here we have churches in the South preaching for slavery. We have great institutions in America, not just in the South, but in the North as well early on, who were preaching for slavery and justifying it through God and religion. So how is that even possible? So what I realized is that evil gathers when we're not paying attention. And then sometimes we find ourselves earlobe deep in it. Yeah, I think it's happening today.
Well, I want to hear more about that because I think that we don't have it figured out any better right now than we have in our understanding of what happened back then, or our understanding of what happened in the Holocaust. This idea of the creeping nature of a collective psychosis, and how it starts with a little bit of compromise with morality and integrity here, a little bit of compromise with your morality and integrity there, and at what point does one human being say, okay, I can make do with this because I get some rewards for my willingness to not look, as opposed to other people for whom there comes a time when that's it, not on my watch.
Yeah, the stories we tell ourselves. I really believe that the stories we tell, the myths that we create, sort of like contemporary modern myths, can be a way to alter consciousness collectively. But it takes time. And we have a story that's been going on for a long time. Pride, not prejudice. I mean, come on.
I know.
We have stories that somehow justify that flag through history. I mean, I grew up hearing stories in the South that things like, the slaves, well, they were well taken care of. You hear things like that. So you
even
hear
today.
Yeah, you do. Actually, I heard that at a book signing I was at in the North, even when I was promoting The Invention of Wings. So it's astonishing how these old tapes and stories get in us and in the culture, and it serves a purpose, though. I mean, they wouldn't exist if they didn't serve the worst thing in us, maybe. But, I think we need new myths and new stories to take their place. And one of the things I wanted to do with The Invention of Wings was to create at least some new way of looking at this. We see the passivity in many stories of slaves, actually, we should say enslaved people instead of slaves. I don't think that's really appropriate now to say that, and rightly so, because they were enslaved by other people. But they were really not passive. They had a great deal of resistance, and they were always fighting, and there was revolution in their hearts, and they weren't putting up with it a lot. And we don't hear those stories. And that was one reason I used the Denmark VC uprising, because I wanted to show that they were taking it in their hand. I also don't think we should even think that the abolitionists freed them necessarily by themselves. Slaves helped to free themselves too. We don't hear those stories. It was heartbreaking to hear all of that,
That's why literature is so important. That's why the storyteller, that's why fiction is so important. You don't let us get away with looking away. Invention of Wings has some of the most cruel depictions of the institution of slavery that I've read anywhere. You can't read that book and not be very aware of the human cruelty that was involved on a very visceral level? And what is the myth that we're telling ourselves today that's helping to maintain this refusal on the part of so many to take a deeper look at the legacies of slavery, the systemic racism that plagues us today? What are the myths that we need to let go?
One reason that I wrote The Invention of Wings is because I wanted to go back to ground zero of racism in this country. I wanted to see where it all started and explore that. This matters a great deal to me. And I always think of what James Baldwin said, that racial history is a shared history. It's not a white history or a black history. It's a shared history of both, because we're both involved in it. And so we all have a history with this, whether we want to admit it or not. And I wanted to go all the way back. The Secret Life of Bees was about the civil rights era. But when I went back to slavery, I discovered that we had told ourselves such incredible myths and lies about it, and that they had persisted. I think American exceptionalism is part of it, actually, because we cannot tolerate knowing this about ourselves. And so we do this, collectively kind of deny it by watering it down, by telling ourselves it wasn't that bad, because it's painful to face. And I think white people don't want to face that particularly. It's better to be either silent about it, don't talk about it, or tell ourselves it wasn't that bad, or minimalize it. So that's one thing we do. And so we see a kind of minimalist approach to it, or a sweet coating it, or a softening of it. The brutality of it was unbelievable. I read about 40 to 50 slave narrative books of slave narratives that were the enslaved people actually telling their stories. And I encountered things that so disturbed my soul, that I had to get up from my desk and go walk and walk and walk until I could come back and write about it. And I couldn't even write the worst of it, is amazingly, because I felt like people wouldn't even read it, but I tried to be unflinching. There is a punishment in there that is extraordinary, yes, that really existed, the one-legged punishment.
I will never forget that scene, Sue.
Well, it's for real. It's a real punishment. And nobody had really written about that. Some of the most creative punishments you can imagine, and all of them that are in the book are real and actual. And I felt like we needed to know about the workhouse. Now, how can we create news stories today? Well, I think that writing fiction is not so much about we don't really need to always hold up a mirror to ourselves and say, this is our culture, look at it. We do need to do that to some extent. But I think we also need to say, this is our culture, look at it, but here's what's possible. Here's something that is actually possible, a new mythology, a new way of seeing. Let's reinterpret something. Let's rewrite history and see how that feels, which was one reason I wrote the Book of Longings. If we can rewrite history in a way that makes us sit up and go, well, I never thought about that. It can make us feel and see differently. So
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, in The Invention of Wings, you do have both. You have the cruelty of the institution of slavery, and you also have the extraordinary character of the Grimke sisters. And to me, that is where we need to be going. The realization that America is both and. We've always been both and that every generation plays out the struggle between the worst aspects of human character, which are embedded here, as well as the better angels of our nature. And history is the journey by which every generation takes its own stand for which it will display. Don't you think that part of what needs to change is the way we teach about these things in American history to our children? We shouldn't be protecting them in an age-appropriate way, of course, but I think children need to learn more about not only slavery, of course, but genocide of Native Americans, et cetera. Isn't that part of what needs to change?
Education is a huge part of it, I'm sure, and I believe that. Um, there's a line in the Invention of Wings, in which I have my character, Sarah Grimke, say, and I just invented this and put it in her mouth because I thought it was true to her. She said, "There is a terrible muteness that dwells at the center of all unspeakable things, and I had found my way into it."
Oh my God, that sounds like something you would write. Yeah, that is so Sue Monk kid prose. Would you please say that line again? Oh my God. Well, that's so quintessentially you. Say it again, please.
There is a terrible muteness that dwells at the center of all unspeakable things, and I had found my way into it. That's Sarah, and that is Sarah trying to acknowledge her own accountability. We're all accountable, and we're evolving, but at snail's pace. And I just want to say one other thing. Education is important, but it's something about individual accountability and individual hearts that have to be transformed one at a time, too. I mean, I would like to legislate it. I would like to legislate compassion, but it's got to change inside people, too. So we've got to work from the inside and the outside on this. But with the George Floyd situation, I felt like we were at another place of falling into an awareness of this unspeakableness and the muteness, and learning that, oh my God, we're all racist. We're all got to look at ourselves and our accountability in new and deeper and more refined and nuanced ways.
Well, you said we were evolving, although at a snail's pace. I'm not so sure we're not at this moment sliding backwards. If you look at some of the pictures from the civil rights movement, some of the photographs, John Lewis and others, one person being brutalized by a policeman, and it sparked the conscience of a nation. Today, and without that spark, the Civil Rights Act would never have been passed, the Voting Rights Act would never have been passed. Today, people see pictures of George Floyd, see pictures of Philippe Castillo, see pictures and know the story of Trayvon Martin, and it is almost like this ubiquitous wave and assault of this is happening now, and yet this collective dissociation. So that right now, I think we're in almost a devolutionary period. And I just want to point out to everybody, I want to show you again the cover of the book, The Invention of Wings, because what's any great writer, this is why literature is so important. When she was talking about the mutiny in the heart, that's what we need right now. We need a mutiny in the heart. A change in consciousness is necessary in order for political systems to change, for social and economic systems to change. You are so unflinching, Sue, in your refusal. You have this amazing way of, it's almost as though there's a personal note from you in your books. I will not let you look away, but I will hold your hand while you're looking. And with my power with words and my power as a writer, I will make it somehow safe for you. And somehow even looking at what is wrong will be part of your own, as you were just mentioning, spiritual path, because you are bearing witness to the agony of others. You are bearing witness to the agony of others. And perhaps there is some way where if we're willing to have a fuller, bearing of witness to the agony of enslaved people hundreds of years ago, we perhaps our eyes will be opened more to bearing witness to the agony of those who are suffering today. Let me ask you about, we've talked here about the connection between the dissociation and the racism underlying, the horrifying racism that was underlying slavery and that underlies systemic racism today. We realize that a stroke of a presidential signature or a constitutional amendment could address the externalities of slavery or segregation or a legislative act such as Civil Rights Act. But those things, no external remedy can dissolve racism itself. That is an expunging of the heart of some deep poison, and that is more religious and spiritual. Now, what you mentioned earlier was that during slavery, there were churches that claim to make it okay. And even today, we have churches. We have people supposedly coming from religious voices who would minimize systemic racism and support racists in power. What are your thoughts about that?
I think you're exactly right there. It is happening today. And when I said a snail's pace, it's like 2 steps forward and 1 back, and 2 steps forward and 1 back. And eventually, we may get there. I don't know. But I have been disillusioned a bit, and I've had to really grasp for the sense of hope that we must have. And ultimately, I am hopeful and I am an idealist because I cling to that. And I just believe that light will prevail eventually. But beside that, yes, in our churches today, and many of the evangelical churches, and I think we're starting to see a few of them kind of become aware. We have seen such a dramatic clinging to, I think, political untruths, to injustice. I heard somebody say the other day, they wish the country could be more Christian. And, somebody else replied, well, I would just settle for Christians being more Christians.
Jew here would agree with you on that one.
So, I mean, it's across the board, but you're right. We see this intransigence within so many of the churches, and it's mind-boggling to me. I cannot explain it because it has so little to do with the figure of Jesus that I read about and learned about and understand. It's amazing how this has become politicized, and they've sort of, lost their way.
And of course, the commitment to social justice in its deepest meaning is as much a core of the Jewish religion and the Muslim religion as well. And all the great religious systems of the world have that as a universal spiritual theme on some level, that we would do justice and live humbly with the Lord. Before we move into the Book of Longings, the connection, I read in one of your interviews that your husband said that he saw you in Anna, the wife of Jesus that you write about in the Book of Longings. But it seems to me that with the writing of The Invention of Wings, I see you in the Grimke sisters as well. They did what they could. You do what you do. I think that's what we're all struggling to do. I think what you and I and others, particularly the modern feminists, sees about someone like the Grimke sisters is that to have stood for what they stood for, not only in their abolitionist views, but also their feminist views, at that time, the bravery, the courage. Before we move on to the Book of Longings, is there anything else you'd like to say about Sarah and about Angelina that could give people a greater sense of the largeness, as you would say, of these women and what it took for their voices? So much of what Sarah prayed for, what Anna prays for in Book of Longings, I feel could have been Sarah and Angelina's prayer as well, that they be given a voice.
Well, I could talk about those two women all day.
Well,
I love them. I love them so much. I mean, when I discovered them, I fell in love with these women who were so brave and audacious and daring, and yet it was so hard for them. I identified with Sarah, I really did, particularly because, growing up in pre-feminist, pre-civil rights South in a small town in Georgia, I saw things I can't unsee. Racial injustice, racial divides, racial cruelties, and just terrible gender inequalities, all kinds of, stereotypes and things.
Did you have parents who taught you that they were wrong?
Yes, I did. I had parents who were not, they were more liberal minded, and they did teach me. But nevertheless, I think the hand of culture on us it can be quite gripping and oppressive. And I had to do what Sarah did, which was to somehow free myself from the confines of the culture that shaped me. And this is a classic thing that people often have to do, particularly women, in order to find our voice. And, the invention of wings was about inventing our wings. It was about not just enslaved people inventing their wings, as we see through the character of Handful, but Sarah inventing her wings because of how oppressed she was as a woman, not just in the South, but all over. I mean, at that time, women could not own property. They had no rights to their own children, even. I mean, it was unbelievable, really. And so what I want to say about Angelina and Sarah, and they called her Devilina, by the way, Angelina's nickname by the mobs and the press was Devilina, because she was so fierce in what she had to say. But what I would love to say about them is they are the ones who started the flame of women's rights in this country. They are really the mothers, and they have not been as acknowledged as they should be. This is the first time really women, American women, and from the South, went out there and said, we deserve to speak. We deserve a platform. Listen to us. We want a voice. They were silenced. They were burned in effigy. It was an incredible backlash against them, and yet they persevered. And that took courage.
And of course, today we are living with the vestiges of all that misogyny, just as we're living with the vestiges of all of the racism. We have not purified human consciousness even in America. Or I shouldn't even say even in America. Not only have we not purified the American psyche of racism, I have come to believe more and more that we have not purified the American psyche of misogyny. And it is just as unconscious in many cases. And I have come to believe that many of the shackles that are no longer physical shackles or legal shackles still exist as emotional and psychological shackles, which keep so many women, even today, Sue, from speaking up about things that I cannot believe we're not all speaking up about. What's the point of power to speak, to use your voice, to tell your story, if you're not taking advantage of it? And I've seen so often how women choose not to go there because of the levels of emotional punishment or psychological punishment that they will get, lack of approval, lack of being loved, etc. Now, I also want to ask you, don't you feel as a writer, as an artist, that part of being an artist is the need to escape the cultural imprint that might keep you from seeing the more universal truths that are part of being an artist?
Yes, I mean the artist, as you say, the writer, has a responsibility to see what no one else sees and to say what no one else is able to say. That's what a real artist does.
Well, that's certainly what you do.
Thank you. That's very nice.
Well, it's so clearly true. And by your willingness to look unflinchingly at things and yet to reveal those things, not just in their historical fact, but in their deeply human, emotional, psychological, as well as spiritual dimension. It's a great gift to all of us. The largeness, you talk about this as the largeness of a woman's story. And the Grimke sisters, there was a largeness there. Before we move on to Anna and her relationship with Jesus in the Book of Longings, would you give us a little bit of information about exactly what they did as abolitionists and exactly what they did as feminists?
Yes, as abolitionists. And I want to draw a fine distinction here between, there were abolitionists who were for immediate emancipation of slavery, and there were actually abolitionists who didn't think slavery was right, but they were willing to contend with it until the right time. Even within abolition, there were degrees and, people were all over the place. But the Grimke sisters were radical. They were more radical than any abolitionist imaginable because they not only believed in emancipation and they not only believed it should happen right now, they believed white and black were equal, absolutely equal, and deserved the same rights. Few abolitionists believed that, actually. And that was quite surprising. They went out and spoke just in the most large way they could about this. And then they were shut down. There was a letter written it was a pastoral letter from a church in Massachusetts in which they were silenced, and they were told all the pulpits were not to receive them anymore to speak, because women were not supposed to speak to what they called mixed audiences. Now, that meant not what you would think, racial. They were talking about men and women. Women were not supposed to speak to men or teach men because they were inferior to men, it was thought. And so they took exception to this because they thought, we can't help the cause of abolition if they shut us up. So they began to fight for the right to speak. And then it quickly turned into the rights of women to speak. And it sparked a whole agenda in this country. And I called them incendiary. And they were,
I love it,
because they did strike that spark that became eventually the feminist movement in this country. So they went off on an abolition tour, and they were orators. Angelina was the first woman to speak before a state legislative body, and she was really the orator. Angelina was the orator. Sarah was the thinker, the writer. And together one was one wing, one was the other, and they just flew with it.
Well, isn't that how every social justice movement begins? A few people considered outrageous radicals by the status quo of their time. And they are the harbingers of what is to come. So,
in fact, I'm sorry, women actually were the ones who kind of took the Vietnam movement. I really feel like women became attuned to their own oppression by fighting for the injustices of other people.
Oh, that's
They
great.
did that in abolition, and they did that through the Vietnam movement. And I think there are real parallels between the anti-war movement of the 60s and what happened with feminism around that time.
Where do you think we are now with feminism, Sue?
Well, I have seen in the 24 years since I wrote my memoir, The Dance of the Dissident Daughter, which is my collision of religion and feminism, I have seen some improvement, but there are deep pockets, not only of racism in this country, and I think systemically racism, but deep pockets in that. I also see this with women. There's a holy misogyny going on.
Absolutely.
And that holy misogyny is that we have our place. It's sort of like segregation in a way. Mm-hmm. Well, you're equal but separate. Uh-huh. You have your roles and men have their roles, but you're all equal, but you're separate.
Yeah, toe the line.
That's right. And so I think we have to push on. My favorite line in the Invention of Wings is just 2 words. And I've signed it in many books, and I say it all the time. I put these words in the mouth of Lucretia Mott, sending a message to Sarah and Angelina, who were out there on the front lines, taking the first hits of backlash against women in this country. And she sent them a message that said, press on, my sisters. That's what we have to do. We just have to press on.
In my career, talking about spirituality and metaphysics, much like you were talking about in Dance of the Dissident Daughters, spirituality and religion is a place where if you're not speaking within a particular denomination, you can pretty much say what you want to say. But I found that in politics, the the strictures are much more harsh, and they are enforced much more severely. And if a woman within the political sector, and all of these issues are political. When you talk about racial inequality today, it's a political issue. When you talk about feminist issues and pay equity, et cetera, today, these are political issues. You can't go deeply into issues of race or issues of misogyny or any issue of social justice without entering into the political conversation, which is a problem because those sectors and those areas, such as race, are so deep. They cannot be contained within the shallow waters of modern politics. So you have these deep conversations that emerge from books like yours and from people and from experiences and from the fact that we're watching what George Floyd's human experience and every single part of us like is erupting with that mutiny that you talked about. And then you have politics, it's a pre-prescribed conversation. We won't go any further to the left or to the right or above or below. And it's a real problem where America is stuck. Because if we can't bring the richness and the multi-layered aspects of these conversations, it's one thing that you can read them in a book, and it's profound in a book like Invention of Wings, and it does expand us as people. But if we're not able to expand the political conversation to contain all that depth, then I don't know how we will make the social and economic and political changes that we need to make.
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah.
And when I ran for president, I really saw the refusal of the system to allow for any conversation that it is not pre-prescribed. Well, that moves us into another place where you speak very profoundly of the largeness of a woman's story, and I want some of these quotes to be here as well. This is the last one that you wrote, and it is called The Book of Longings. Sue Monkhead in the Book of Longings, and it is the story of Jesus having been married. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, there's a daring idea, right?
Yeah, well, that's you, so nobody expects anything less at this point.
Oh, boy. Yeah, well, that occurred to me to do back in 2014. After I finished The Invention of Wings, I was really spent. I mean, I thought I had not a drop left in me to give. I thought, I had to fill my tank for a long time after that. And then I was sitting at my desk one day and I was reading a National Geographic article about this fragment of a papyrus that a Harvard professor had introduced to the world it has a reference in it to Jesus' wife. Now, I'll quickly say this was it turned out to be fraudulent.
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't matter to me because I wasn't interested in whether Jesus really had a wife or not. I was interested in imagining it. And so I began to imagine it, and it really captured my imagination. And I got an image right away of a young woman. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting, curious, phenomenal even, if we could imagine a story, if we could rewrite a story in which during the early years of Jesus' life, he had a wife long before his ministry. What about those younger years, those missing years, we call them? What was he doing at 18 and 20? But I want to also say that while this was compelling to me, what most inspired me and kept me writing this story for 4.5 years was Anna herself. I mean, I loved this character. I love all my characters, actually, but this one I truly loved. And she was rebellious, ambitious, strong-willed, at times difficult. She had a great largeness in her. She had a brilliance in her. But most of all, she had a passion. She wanted to be a scribe. She wanted to have a voice in the world. She wanted to take what was inside of her and articulate it and have it make a difference out there. And this was her longing. And it was a quest. And that's what drew me into this story, and that's what moved that story for me forward.
I want to create the context for everyone here. We know, of course, Jesus pretty much disappears after his bar mitzvah, and we see him again when he begins his ministry. So that's 13 to 30. So there are 17 years that are called the missing years. And it would have been very unlikely for a Jewish man living at that time not to have been married, right, Sue?
That's right. Yes.
And of course, once again, it's what you do with these characters, these female characters. You refuse to allow her to be somehow the secondary character. If anything, Jesus is the secondary character in the way you tell the story. The Jesus character, in terms of his relationship with her, is a pretty woke guy. I mean, it's a very modern type of interaction that they have here in terms of her wanting to express her own power and how he viewed it. One of the things that I loved in the book was, it's called the Book of Longings. So much of what you talk about is a woman's longing. The whole idea of misogyny is that a woman is somehow kept from living out the fullness of her longing. But one of the beautiful sentences in the book is when she first meets Jesus, or one of their very early, I think it was the second time she met him. And you said it was the moment when our belonging first revealed itself. I thought it was so interesting that our longing is for belonging.
Well, so often it is, yes, for all of us.
Then can you tell us a little bit about not only how you saw Anna in the ways that you just described and how she had so much inside her that she wanted to live, but will you tell us a little about the relationship between Jesus and Anna as you saw it?
Well, I wanted them to have, I've called it many times, a great love. I don't know what else to call it. I felt they deserved that. I wanted them in a way to model what might be possible in a great love, where there is both freedom and belonging, where they each have their individual lives, but they are connected deeply at the heart. So that's what I tried to do. But at the same time, it had to be a human marriage, a human relationship. And so there was conflict in it. And I portrayed conflict in this marriage. And, Jesus, in my version of this story, I focused on the human Jewish man, not the mythic Christ, but the historic Jesus, the
and
human
he was
being.
A human
Well, he was.
Jewish
Yes, he was.
Man.
Well, thoroughly. Yes, he was. And that's what I wanted to portray, because I feel like we have sort of lost touch with that somehow, that his divinity has sort of taken over our ideas and eclipsed, in a way, his great humanity. Because if we lose sight of the humanity of a rather enlightened person, to say the least, maybe we lose touch with our own ability to be compassionate or inclusive or stand for justice, because we're human too, and he's human. If he did it, we could do it.
Well,
so I wanted to focus on that.
It's the intersection of the human and the divine, which is the meaning not only of his experience, but the meaning of all of our experience. If you look at the Christian cross and you look at the Jewish Star of David, both of them are symbolic representations of the intersection point of the horizontal and the vertical. And if you only go into the vertical, theology is abstract, whereas the whole point of God in flesh, the idea of the spirituality incarnate, is the idea that these things matter in our human experience. And of course, that takes me to the subject of sex. One of the things that of course obviously gets cut out when you say, Jesus is all about the divine, and we're going to minimize or not talk much about his humanity. One of the things, of course, that gets erased there is the more difficult question, to some people more difficult, the question of his sexuality. And one of the questions that Anna asks 30 years after the death of Jesus is the marriage having been erased. And I think there's a line in the book about the sting of erasure, And I think that so many women feel, even today, how could you erase me? How could you just erase me from this conversation? I love that she said, did they think making him celibate rendered him more spiritual?
Yeah. Well, a question that I wrote on a card and I propped on my desk as I wrote this book and that was very always in my mind was, how would the world be different if Jesus had married and had a partner who was part of the story? Would the world be different? I mean, he's had such an impact, and his religion that followed has had such an impact on history of everyone, in Western world. And I just feel like it would be very different. And that's one way that it would be different. I don't think there would be such a wide gap, chasm really, between sexuality and spirituality, that we would find a more integrated wholeness.
Also, in the scene in Book of Longings, when he saves her, he rescues her from being stoned, that's basically the biblical story that's actually in the Bible, of Jesus saving the woman from being stoned, right?
Yes. Actually, I co-opted several of those.
So couldn't it actually be argued that it's not just that we don't see Jesus as having been married, but that there is this willful ignoring of many things that are included in the Christian Bible, where Jesus makes it clear his respect for women as well as children?
Yes, I think he was unique in that way, for sure, in that time and place, because women were completely suppressed, their voices in their lives. Some people have said, well, there were no feminists back then, Sue, and you got her as a feminist. Well, she is. I wanted this to have a contemporary feel to it. I wanted it to be relevant. What's the point of historical fiction if it's not relevant to where we are today? And I wanted to write this story true to the time, and it's grounded in huge, vast research. But at the same time, it had to feel real and contemporary and relevant to people today. And definitely, I think we have to, look at how Anna's life and Jesus' life impacts us.
When your friend said, or your acquaintance, whomever it was, said there were no feminists in those days, that's someone who doesn't know much about history. I mean, the Jewish women of the Bible, if you read even a book like The Red Tent, sometimes we're very arrogant at how we look at former generations. I mean, for that matter, Cleopatra was alive when Jesus, in those days. I mean, there are major stories of profoundly empowered women throughout history. The idea that the struggle is just beginning is simply incorrect, right?
Well, women have always had that longing in their heart for freedom, and you can't convince me of otherwise. And you can find things on the record, primary documents that show us this, not only in scripture, but in other documents. Unfortunately, though, they're not as many as we would like to be able to, and there's a reason for that. Because women's stories weren't told. Because women's
women were
history
not allowed
wasn't
to
told.
spread. Right. They were not allowed to spread their wings. That's the whole point of the invention. They were not allowed. I remember I remember hearing once Steven Spielberg talking about the Holocaust. He said, how many scientists did we never experience? How many geniuses at this or that? How many great novels did we never have? How many great doctors did we never have? And of course, that's true of slavery. And of course, it's true of women. How many, you look at a woman like Mary Cassatt. But how many other women would have been great painters? How much talent and the pain that so many women would have felt in their own grating against the system that did not allow them to be everything they could be. In the Invention of Wings, it's very clear what you want us to see. It's very clear that we have a deeper appreciation and even agony over the reality of the institution of slavery, as well as a deeper appreciation of the story of the Grimke sisters and all people like them and all women like them who made a stand for justice, not only in terms of race, but in terms of gender. What is your hope for the Book of Longings? What, when you were writing it, what was the primary gift? Because all of your books give a profound gift. You can't read a Sue Monk Kidd novel without feeling you have poured something, it's like she just poured some illumination into me. What is the gift? And yet, because of my own feelings about Jesus, my own feelings about women, I know some of the places I go. Where do you go in your own mind in terms of what you would like to be the great illumination of this book, of the Book of Longings?
Oh, I could talk a long time about that too. So many things, Marianne, that I wish for and hope for. My greatest wish for anyone who reads one of my books, it's kind of a big umbrella wish for all my books, is that story or that book is a portal that takes them into the common heart of the world. I want them to feel empathy. I want them to put themselves in places, drop them in the lives of people whom they need to know and need to know the suffering or the ecstasies or the pains and the longings that these people have, so that it wakens the heart, that we have the little mutiny of the heart we were talking about. I believe there is a common heart in the world, and I learned that from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is a great American thinker. And he talked about the oversoul, and he believed, in that context, he talked about the common heart, which is this place where we have a shared humanity with everyone on earth. That's the place I want my books to take people. And I know that's a big, grand wish. But with the Book of Longings in a particular way, I want women and men who read the book to think about their own largeness, to think about their own particular genius that they have been given. I think about John Lewis, who said, we have to put feet to our prayers, or we have to put feet to our passions. So what is your largeness? What is your longing? What is your passion? What is your particular genius? And how do you put feet to that? How do you manifest it and bring it forth, not only for yourself, but for the world around you, for the common heart? So it's that.
Well, if your desire is to, with your books, take people into the heart of our common humanity, I can tell you as a reader of your books that you succeed brilliantly. And I want everybody to know this is the Book of Longings, as extraordinary as the Invention of Wings, as extraordinary as the Mermaid Chair, as extraordinary as the Dance of the Dissonant Daughter, as extraordinary as Secret Life of Bees. I'm going to say something very presumptuous here. I did it with Michael Lewis in a conversation we had, like, who am I to suggest what you might write about next? But I hope when you are filing away in your mind ideas, when you just mentioned Ralph Waldo Emerson, you brought up for me a topic which fascinates me, and that's Concord, Massachusetts from 1850 to 1855. Talk about a portal. Talk about a vortex. Talk about a genius cluster, because they were all there. It was Emerson, it was Whitman, it was Melville, it was Poe, it was Margaret Fuller, right? It was Louisa May Alcott, and boy, talk about her longing. Oh my God. And how she died. And anyway, you certainly don't need me to suggest topics, but that is certainly a not just a story, but a group of stories that need the kind of literary genius that someone such as yourself could bestow. I can't thank you enough for being with me on the podcast today, but I can't thank you enough for, really, it's very personal for me. Your books have been a major source of illumination for me, and obviously for millions of other people as well. And what you bring, not just making us understand more about the 1800s, not just making us understand more about what happened 2,000 years ago, but I think making us understand more about ourselves, making us understand about what's happening in the world today, and even more importantly, how we, like your characters, could in our own time change the world. I think you're a great American as well as a great artist. I cannot thank you enough.
Well, I'm awed by that, and I want to thank you too for having me. It's been so much fun and exciting to talk to you today, and you're a great light in America too, and I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you, Sue. Thank you. What an honor to say that. All my love to you. Thank you so much.
Yes, you too.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. You know, when my daughter was a little girl and I knew Harry Potter novel came out. It was always such a big deal. It's coming out tomorrow. It's coming out tomorrow. It's coming out tomorrow. And that's how I feel whenever a new Sue Monk Kidd novel is coming out, because whatever it is, I know it's something that's going to feed my soul. And I'm always so eager to hear what she has to say. So now it's time for Ask Marianne, where I take some questions that came in. It's always interesting for me to know what you're thinking, and I appreciate you wanting to know what I'm thinking about your issues. Okay, this is from someone named Michael. Hi, Marianne. I'm such a huge fan of your work. I am an early 20s professional who aligns myself very strongly with the kind of politics you espouse: justice, love, equity, and the courage to ensure these things are done. My question for you is how you would go about challenging or correcting the following notion. Quote, if the U.S. government were to give reparations to Black Americans, it would create a renewal of racism among white people who do not believe anybody should get reparations, as nobody alive today was ever a slave. My father, unquote, my father does not understand the need for reparations, and he is concerned that reparations would have a rubber band effect and intensify racism among white Americans. He is opposed to racism, but does not ultimately understand the difference between that and anti-racism. Thank you so much for this podcast. I remain committed to the kind of vision you and I share for the future, because I believe it's my true calling to be part of the millions of people who will need to stand in order to save this country and our planet. But thank you particularly about this question about reparations. I think it's an important topic. First of all, anytime you have a big change, this would have been even beginning with the American Revolution. Most of the American colonists at that point were royalists. The majority of people in the United States, well, it wasn't the United States yet, but most of the people in the colonies were not for the revolution. When segregation was finally dismantled with the Civil Rights Act, there were a lot of people who did not agree with that decision. When Social Security was established, a lot of people did not agree with that decision. When the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote, a lot of people did not agree with that decision. So there's never going to be a fundamental political and social change where everybody is necessarily in agreement. But I do think this. I think on the part of your father and many other people, there might be a misunderstanding about reparations. I think, Michael, that a lot of Americans are vastly undereducated and underinformed about the history of race in the United States. And what I have found as I've traveled the country, even among some of the whitest states, the whitest audiences, is that a lot of people have not really recognized, they weren't taught, they haven't thought about it, the severity and the brutality over 2.5 centuries that we're talking about, the millions of lives that we're talking about. If you're talking about an institution that began when the first slave ships came here in 1619, then really revved up with the slave trade in the 1800s. And then, of course, the Civil War, we're talking about the 1860s. At the end of the Civil War, it's estimated that there were between 4 and 6 million formerly enslaved people. You're talking about millions and millions and millions of people here over 2.5 centuries. And then we're also recognizing that except for the 12 years of Reconstruction, there was another 100 years of domestic terrorism perpetrated against Blacks in the American South in the form of segregation. Now, your father may or may not know that paying economic restitution in the form of reparations when one people has done a historic wrong is not an unusual concept. He may or may not know that that Germany paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations after World War II. And it was the generation after the generation after. So when Germany paid reparations for World War II, most of those people could also say, hey, I didn't do it. But it doesn't matter that you didn't do it. What matters, it's just like when a company buys another company and you inherit the assets as well as the debts. We inherit the assets of former generations, but we also inherit the debts of former generations. And that debt is being paid even now. The racial tension in this country, the continued legacies of slavery, the continued economic gap that it continues to exist between whites and blacks in America, all of which are a direct a result of slavery. You might say, I didn't do it, but we're experiencing all of this even now. It is a line from Faulkner, the past isn't over. It's not even past. In all of our lives, you have to clean up the past in order to go forward. And that is as true of a nation as it is true of an individual. Michael, please tell your father that it has been established that if black families manifest as much wealth as white families, our economy would be $1.5 trillion larger. If black families manifest as much wealth as white families, our economy would be $1.5 trillion larger. So on the level of the soul, on the level of the spirit, emotionally, psychologically, but also economically, paying reparations would not only be a blessing on black people in America, I think it would be a blessing on white people, and it would certainly be a blessing on our children because they'd have an opportunity to be raised ultimately, finally, please, in the absence of the racial inequality, tension, anger, and pain that underlies so much of American society because of this issue. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate your asking the question. Okay, this next question is from Tim. Dear Marianne, you were one of the first people to start regularly bringing trauma and trauma-informed public policy into discussions of modern politics. There is no question that trauma is one of the most important root causes of dysfunction that can be attributed to virtually every single one of the societal and systemic issues we're facing today in America. Despite this, trauma remains a topic that is addressed only in a silo and is not viewed from an integrative perspective. We only talk about trauma when we're looking at issues such as abuse, violence, or children. But as you of all people know, those are not the only subjects where trauma is a factor. Something I've been saying recently is that we have traumatized people who are making and enforcing traumatizing policies, which then go on to traumatize more people, thus perpetuating the pendulum-like codependent cycle of trauma negatively impacting society. My question, what are some ways that we can start normalizing discussing the topic of trauma as it relates to public policy? Much love and gratitude, Tim. Wow, Tim, thank you so much for that. There's so much there. Wow. And I agree with you. You mentioned children. And one of the things that I talked about when I ran for president was how we need a Department of Children and Youth because we have millions, tens of millions of American children, this was even before the pandemic, who are chronically traumatized, including the fact that they live in neighborhoods often called domestic war zones, that they go to schools where they worry about violence in the schools, where they go to schools where they're not getting, the schools do not have the resources to give them the kind of education they need. If a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation become drastically decreased. The chances of incarceration become drastically increased. Now, this child at the age of 10 or 12 realizes, I can't read, the other kids in the class can read. The trauma that child is going through, the trauma of despair, the trauma of their hopelessness. And of course, as we say here so often, large groups of desperate people are a national security risk. They become a petri dish out of which so much societal dysfunction and despair is almost to be expected. And Tim, one of the things that I've been thinking about and talking about recently, which is why I'm so glad that you brought up, is the catastrophic consequences of the disregard being shown today by our government towards the millions and millions of Americans today who are dealing with the consequences of this pandemic in the most egregious ways. We have 50 million hungry Americans in the United States today. We have 30 million people who could be facing eviction. And this is interesting in light of your question because so many of those families have children inside them. And those children who are hungry, those children who are watching the despair of their parents are going to grow up into angry and traumatized adults. And we now talk about some of the dysfunctional groups that we have of angry people. If you want to have a more safe and secure economy and society 10 years from now, 15 years from now, create a more secure and wholesome and healthy childhood for the children who are in your midst today. So you are absolutely right, Tim. And also what you said, it's in a silo. I found, for instance, when I ran for president, that it was considered weird or kooky to bring these topics into the political conversation. What's kooky is that we're not. Any Fortune 500 CEO that goes to a business retreat today, might find themselves at a meditation session. Harvard University has symposiums about integrative medicine. In education, they talk about the whole person child. The whole child. It's only in politics that they act like, ooh, it's weird to talk about psychological dynamics. How can we say that when you have the hate groups that are among us today, the collectivized hatred that we're having to deal with in this country? Isn't this everything that people are trying to figure out about the Holocaust? How did it happen? How did this collective psychosis come upon us? There are books written about Rwanda. How did that collective psychosis that led to the Rwandan genocide arise? Now, these were not that long ago. And yet today, we're seeing hatred and bigotry and racism and all of those horrible characterological facets, anti-Semitism, homophobia, even today being politically collectivized. The idea that we shouldn't be talking about trauma, the idea that we shouldn't be talking about the psychological and emotional dimensions of all this, that's what should be considered fringe, weird, and wacky. It's thinking from our political conversation is thinking from the 20th century that some people are trying to apply to 21st century problems. And our 21st century problems need 21st century solutions and problem-solving methodology that has to include more than just the external aspects of a situation, but instead include a deeper psychological understanding of what caused the problem, what was at the root of the problem. And Tim, you are absolutely right. Often that root and that cause is trauma, particularly among the young. So, thank you for bringing it up. You'll continue to talk about these things. I will continue to talk about these things. And hopefully we are starting to make a difference. Okay, that was our podcast for today. I want to thank all the incredible people at CAST. I want to thank Lauren Selsky. I want to thank Wendy Zoller, Amanda Elliott, everybody who has to do with bringing this together for your listening pleasure. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you will be with us next week. And if you are enjoying the podcast, I hope that you'll go over to iTunes and rate it for us and review. Check it out, tell your friends, and also go over to YouTube. Thanks so much.